October 2015. A glass-walled conference room in Palo Alto, California. And a young woman in her signature black turtleneck sat across from a team of federal investigators, her blue eyes steady and her voice never once wavering, even as the investigators placed document after document on the table before her, each one a piece of evidence suggesting that the revolutionary blood testing technology she had promised to the world, the technology that had made her the youngest self-made female billionaire in American history with a company valued at $9 billion, had never actually worked the way she had told everyone it did, and that the hundreds of thousands of patients who had received blood test results from her machines had received results that were, in many cases, dangerously, catastrophically wrong. What kind of person sits in that room and does not break? And what kind of system allowed this to go on for more than a decade before anyone stopped it? This story begins in 2003, when Elizabeth Holmes was just 19 years old and had already decided that she was going to change medicine forever, dropping out of Stanford University after only 1 year to found a company called Theranos, a name she created by combining the words therapy and diagnosis, because in her mind, the two things would become inseparable once her technology existed. A technology she described as a device small enough to sit on a countertop that could run hundreds of different medical tests from just a single drop of blood taken from a finger prick rather than a full vein draw, delivering results in a fraction of the time and at a fraction of the cost of traditional laboratory testing. And the promise was so extraordinary, so genuinely beautiful in what it could mean, and for human health, that almost everyone who heard it wanted desperately to believe it. Think about what that promise actually meant for a moment, because the analogy is worth sitting with carefully. Imagine that every single time a doctor wanted to check the status of a patient's health, that patient had to travel to a separate facility, wait for an appointment, have a needle inserted into their arm, and then wait days for results that might come back unclear or incomplete. And now imagine that all of that is replaced by a single tiny prick of the fingertip, a drop of blood smaller than what a mosquito takes, processed in minutes by a device no larger than a desktop printer. That is what Holmes was selling, and if it had been real, it would have been one of the most important medical inventions of the 20th century, which is precisely why so many extraordinarily intelligent people chose not to ask the question that should have been obvious from the very beginning. Did the machine actually work? Between 2004 and 2014, Holmes raised more than $900 million from investors who included media mogul Rupert Murdoch, the family of Education Secretary Betsy DeVos, and Oracle founder Larry Ellison, and she assembled a board of directors whose names read less like a technology startup and more like a roster of American institutional power, with former Secretary of State George Shultz, former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, former Secretary of Defense James Mattis, and former Senator William Frist, all lending their reputations to a company that had, behind closed doors, been struggling for years to make its core technology function reliably, cycling through dozens of engineers and scientists who raised concerns and were either dismissed or pressured into silence. In a cult, where questioning the machine was treated not as scientific responsibility, but as personal disloyalty to the vision of the founder herself. What does it mean when a 19-year-old with no medical degree and no background in laboratory science tells experienced biochemists that their doubts are simply a failure of imagination? What does it mean when the investors who could have demanded independent verification of the technology instead accepted glossy presentations and carefully staged demonstrations where the actual Theranos device was frequently not the machine doing the testing at all? Because Theranos had quietly been running the majority of its patient samples on commercially available third-party equipment purchased from companies like Siemens, modifying those machines in ways that manufacturers warned would compromise accuracy, and then reporting results under the Theranos name as though the proprietary Edison device had generated them. A deception so fundamental to the entire business model that it is difficult to understand how it was sustained for as long as it was. By 2013, Theranos had signed a partnership with Walgreens, one of the largest pharmacy chains in the United States, and had opened testing centers inside Walgreens locations across Arizona and California, offering patients the ability to walk in without a doctor's order and have their blood tested for conditions ranging from cholesterol levels to HIV to cancer markers. And patients were doing exactly that, making medical decisions, stopping medications, starting treatments, worrying about diagnoses that were either false positives generated by inaccurate machines or missing real conditions that the machines had failed to detect. And all of this was happening in real time to real people who believed they were receiving the gold standard of modern medical testing because the brochures said SE. Oh, and because Elizabeth Holmes had appeared on the covers of Fortune and Forbes and Time magazine and had been celebrated as the next Steve Jobs, a comparison she actively cultivated by wearing the same black turtleneck every single day. Now consider what was happening inside the company at this exact same moment, because the internal reality of Theranos between 2013 and 2015 is one of the most documented cases of institutional self-deception in the history of American business. Laboratory directors were resigning in protest over accuracy concerns. Employees were being asked to falsify quality control records. The company's own internal data showed failure rates that would have been unacceptable in any accredited medical laboratory, and a culture of fear had been constructed with such deliberate precision that scientists who had dedicated their careers to the accuracy of diagnostic testing found themselves unable to speak freely, even among colleagues, because the walls of Theranos headquarters had ears, and because the legal team, led by David Boies of Boies Schiller, had constructed non-disclosure agreements so aggressive that former employees feared financial ruin if they spoke publicly about what they had witnessed. What broke the story was not a whistleblower with a press conference, not a regulator with a subpoena, but a single Wall Street Journal reporter named John Carreyrou, who spent more than a year carefully building a network of former employees willing to speak anonymously about what they had seen inside the company, cross-referencing their accounts with scientific literature and expert opinions on laboratory science, and publishing the first critical investigative piece in October 2015, at which point Theranos and its legal team responded not by addressing the substance of the reporting, but by attacking the sources, threatening litigation, and having Holmes appear on national television to describe the reporting as demonstrably false, a strategy that might have worked in an earlier era of Dia, but that crumbled almost immediately under the weight of what the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services found when federal inspectors walked through the Newark, California laboratory in November 2015 and documented failure after failure after failure in the most basic standards of laboratory practice. The CMS findings were devastating in a way that no journalistic reporting, however accurate, could fully replicate, because they represented the official judgment of the federal agency responsible for overseeing every clinical laboratory in the United States. And what that agency found at Theranos was a laboratory that posed immediate jeopardy to patient health and safety, a finding that triggered a series of consequences that moved with the slow and grinding certainty of institutional machinery. The revocation of Theranos' laboratory certification in July 2016, the ban on Holmes from operating any clinical laboratory for 2 years, the voiding of 2 years of Edison test results, and the notification of hundreds of thousands of patients that their results might be unreliable, the dissolute ion of the Walgreens and Safeway partnerships that had been the commercial foundation of the entire enterprise, and the evaporation of a $9 billion valuation in the span of roughly 18 months. Holmes and her former president and romantic partner Ramesh Balwani, known as Sunny Balwani, were charged by the Department of Justice with wire fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud in June 2018, with the government arguing that both had knowingly defrauded investors and patients by making false representations about the capabilities and accuracy of the Edison device and about the company's financial performance. And what followed was one of the most closely watched criminal trials in Silicon Valley history. A trial that asked a jury of 12 ordinary Americans to assess whether the founder of a startup worth $9 billion had genuinely believed in a technology that did not work, or whether she had known it did not work and had chosen to keep selling it anyway, which is the difference between a failed visionary and a criminal, and which is a line that the jury, after deliberating for 7 days in January 2022, concluded Holmes had crossed. Holmes was convicted on 4 of 11 counts, including 3 counts of wire fraud against investors and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud against investors, acquitted on counts related to patient fraud in a verdict that was widely described as mixed and that left both sides of the courtroom with reasons to claim partial victory. And she was sentenced in November 2022 to 11 years and 3 months in federal prison, a sentence that her legal team immediately appealed, arguing that the district court had made errors in the jury instructions and in its assessment of the loss amount attributed to her conduct. And as of the time this video was made, the legal process continues to move through the federal appellate system with the methodical slowness that characterizes every case, in which 9 figures of investor money and the credibility of an entire regulatory system are at stake. Balwani was tried separately, convicted on all 12 counts against him in July 2022, and sentenced to nearly 13 years in federal prison, a sentence longer than Holmes received that reflected the jury's finding that his culpability was at least as significant as hers, and that his role in managing the laboratory operations and suppressing internal dissent had been central to the sustained deception that allowed Theranos to operate for as long as it did. And the combined legal reckoning for the 2 people at the top of Theranos stands as one of the most significant fraud prosecutions in the history of the American technology industry, though it has done nothing to return the money lost by investors, to compensate the patients whose medical decisions were shaped by unreliable test ratio (LTS), or to answer the deeper question of how a company operating in a field as heavily regulated as clinical diagnostics managed to avoid serious scrutiny for more than a decade. The answer to that question lives somewhere in the intersection of celebrity culture and venture capital logic, in a system where the combination of a compelling founder narrative, a prestigious board of directors, and a promise too beautiful to be false was enough to suspend the basic due diligence that would have revealed, very quickly, that no peer-reviewed research had ever validated the Edison device, that no independent laboratory had ever confirmed its accuracy, and that the scientific literature on finger-prick blood testing contained serious and well-documented reasons to be skeptical that such a device could ever perform reliably across the full range of tests Theranos claimed it could run. And the lesson that the Theranos collapse left behind for every investor who writes a large check into a healthcare startup is simply this: the more extraordinary the claim, the more ordinary and rigorous the verification must be, because the gap between a $9 billion valuation and a machine that does not work is exactly as wide as the space between what people wanted to believe and what the evidence actually showed.